Once again, in his office. Just came back from a nice little trip. We were chatting about that prior to being on air. Today we're going to be talking about, well, first we have to define some things, don't we, Dr. Tino? The difference between disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, these buzzwords that we hear before we can really talk about how it's affecting us, correct?
Yes, well, there are a number of factors. One is we have to clarify the terms, right? Because they're used interchangeably. And there are difference between misinforming and disinforming, right? But the main reason really has to do with um, purpose. It has to do with the fact that when we talk about misinformation, any of us can be provided incorrect or misleading information, right? But it's unintentionally presented as fact, meaning it's not our purpose to mislead. Okay, we may be wrong, right? But at the same time, if we're presenting information that is not factual and we made a mistake, we don't know that it's not factual, we have certain responsibility of correcting that, right? So misinformation can be corrected. Disinformation is where you get into a situation where people are deliberate. They're deliberately deceptive. They're really trying to be deceptive with the information they're provided, whether it's for political reasons, power reasons, political reasons, whatever it is. You purposely know that what you're providing is deceptive, right? So there is a fine line because when we're listening to information, whether it's on video or we're listening to information online on social media, right? We don't take the time to ask that question. Am I being misinformed? Is this person being deceptive? You probably remember seeing in social media, for example, during the political campaigns, breaking news, right? So when you see in social media breaking news, that's a huge red flag, right?
Hmm.
For you to take a step back and say, okay, where is this coming from? Who's providing it? Is the person who put it up reliable? Where did they get it from? Right? Can you provide me with the link of where you obtained this information? Those kinds of things, because we had to be suspicious, in particular with social media, and we'll get into the other media in a minute, but in particular with social media, because you don't know where the information comes from. So from the outset, you have to take this information that is presenting as news with a grain of salt. You really have to be careful.
So, if misinformation and disinformation are, as you described, are distinctly different, it's very possible for an organization, a group, whether it's a media group, a politician, or whatever, can use another as the misinformation in their disinformation campaign. Their strategy of disinformation, they'll take a talking head, whoever it is, and say, okay, have these guests on or talk about this specific subject matter, and they are misinforming people, but not for purposeful reasons, but the people above them, the puppet masters, so to speak, or the owners of that media source, are.
Well, yes, because, and it's happened to some of the major media outlets recently, where they're purposely providing disinformation, right? And primarily the large conglomerates of news will use this information. One is for profit, the second one is for political leaning, and the other potential reason is to maintain people disinformed for political reasons, right? Because once somebody gets misinformed, it becomes extremely difficult to change their facts, right? We cognitively have this need for certainty. And if somebody with authority gives us some certainty, okay, we believe it becomes our reality. So there's some need in the cult to keep feeding this information to maintain the attachment, right? And there are historical facts going back thousands of years of how politicians, for example, or anarchists or fascists have used that tool, right, to keep the cult going. And it becomes, in certain cases, almost delusional. So this information, even though it's one of the favorite tools of advertising, right, because you want to make money, because somebody's going to buy this, You know, we see it all the time with vitamins and supplements, right? Okay,
Mhm.
buy this supplement because it's going to make you more masculine, or you're going to get a better erection, or whatever they want to do with it, right? Which is not factual, okay? And you know it's not factual, it's not supported by scientific evidence, but you're going to say it anyway because you want to sell that product, right? So when people started, let's get into vaccines, for example. When people started going into the anti-vax for political reasons, you have to maintain the anti-vax process, right? So you can continue your political power, right? And that is not only deceptive, it's hypocritical.
Mhm.
It's almost cynical to some degree, right? To see all these people on the outlets that require you to be vaccinated, but at the same time, when you're giving your opinions, you're against vaccines. That is not only deceptive, it's dishonest.
Mhm.
So, what we have learned, and what we have learned over the last few years, is that people have been given permission to be dishonest and deceptive. Okay. And some people have taken that permission as a profit matter, right? If I use it, I make money. And I don't care what anybody else thinks. I don't care if people die. I don't care who's going to get hurt because it's just about me making money or me maintaining power.
Mhm. So the reason I asked that initial question, there's something that's popped up in the news, as we discussed before this, the Joe Rogan Spotify incident. And the reason I asked is, I mean, I don't know Joe Rogan personally, though we've had people on this podcast, Kyle Kingsbury, who does know him personally, and some other folks. Um, he seems to be kind of pleading innocence, saying, "Hey, look, I'm just doing my show." So, who really is responsible for the guests of the show that are spreading misinformation on his show? Is it him as the person who's the co-host, or the owners of the Spotify, and they're the ones who are actually have a disinformation campaign for the profit?
Well, when you have a podcast and you become as powerful podcasting as Joe Rogan is, and then you sell your podcast to Spotify, you become kind of a partner. So
Hmm.
there is a dual process. However, you as the main person delivering your opinions and delivering the interviews with other people, you have certain responsibility on who's in your show, right? Now, you may not have total control with the advertising or who's wanting to buy that type of information, so the Spotify makes money. So everybody is, uh, to a degree, responsible, right? Um, so the issue is that we have a public that is hungry for disinformation, who is willing to listen to that, right? And on the other hand, we have people in media and social media, and I don't know what we call it, Spotify, and because it's not well defined, right? For profit. So everybody has to take a step back and say, okay, wait a minute. Um, what is our responsibility, right? If you were in the old days, if you were writing something like that in a newspaper, right, you had certain responsibility. But because these outlets and these new media of podcasting are not considered news, or they're not considered um, being ruled by the same pattern of behavior that is expected of certain outlets, then they give themselves permission to push the boundaries, right? So I think that what you're seeing, and I don't know Joe Rogan, and I think that he may be the most wonderful person in the world. But once you sell your product to a bigger agency, you kind of uh, at the mercy to some degree of the guidance you're going to get from these outlets, right? But you still have to be able to have some control over the editorial part of your program, right? So I don't have a problem with Joe Rogan interviewing a physician who's an anti-vaxxer, right? But I do think that Joe Rogan has some responsibility of setting the parameters of truth and to challenge, right? Or to have two different opinions to discuss two different things. Because the problem is, and I don't think that Joe Rogan got into this by choice, but he has ended up being identified as with one side versus the other side. And I think that our responsibility when we're in social media and we're talking is to balance, right? Uh, Now, balance may not be the most profitable way of doing what you're doing, but I do think I still think, and maybe I'm old fashioned. I'm older than all of you guys. I do believe that values are important. I do believe that honesty is important. I do believe that protecting people from themselves sometimes is important. I mean, the whole issue of free speech. Fine, I'm fine with free speech. I love free speech. I practice free speech, but I don't walk into a movie theater and yell fire, right? And that is irresponsible. And what is happening in social media to a high degree is that you have somebody walking into a movie theater yelling fire, saying, "Don't get vaccinated." Okay, you're gonna get a microchip, and the government is gonna be following you, right?
Mm.
Uh, you should be taking this medication or that medication when most of these people are not physicians, and there is a counter opinion to that. So the balance has been lost and the values have been lost. So I think it's terribly important that we take a step back and say, what are we trying to accomplish? And we define our purpose in a more balanced, value based way, right?
So, to that point, what advice would you give Joe Rogan as an individual? I mean, here, I mean, really, I mean, here's a guy who, again, is just trying to make a living, right? We'll give him that. He's doing this podcast, but he has kind of fallen into that trap. Now, of course, if he talks up too much, he may lose his job. But you know,
I mean, again, I'm
I
nobody
mean,
to
Joe,
give.
if you're listening,
Yeah,
I was
I
just
mean,
saying.
I'm nobody to give Joe Rogan advice. He's not my patient. He has not requested my services. But anybody in that position, whether it's Joe Rogan or whoever it is, I think that we need to take a deep breath, right, and redefine our business plan to the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I'm very business plan oriented, right, and try to define certain parameters of where we want to be, right? We don't have to eat the whole cake once. And in my point of view, I mean, being at my age and being in this business for 32 years, there's got to be longevity, right? And I mean, we know that controversy sells, but controversy also kills.
Mhm.
So we need to balance those two, right? And maybe Joe needs to have some balance in his program and bring other guests, right? And I think it would be very interesting to see a pro-vaxxer and an anti-vaxxer together, and have a discussion with Joe Rogan as a mediator,
I
right?
think those shows pretty much went away. PBS, that's where you used to find Counterpoint and all those other things. And I mean, to a certain extent, even, NPR and the public stations are doing less of that and tend to be trying to stay neutral, but they're doing, or, and some would people say with left, but they seem to be doing less of bringing those people in,
But
maybe because they think it's going to devolve into just some crazy argument.
yeah, but I'm old enough to remember when some of the most radical hosts in TV today used to do those programs.
Yeah,
The left and the right, remember?
yeah, absolutely.
And I'm watching those programs and finding fascinating for me to create my own opinion. What is happening is now they're selling opinions, and we need to stop selling opinions. We need to start selling facts and trust people with their decision making. Right? I mean, we have moved back to witch hunting, pitchfork, yelling and screaming. A lot of scripture in the mouth with a lot of hate in the heart, and we need to move away from that. That's dangerous. People will die.
So for people who are sucked into that, maybe the advice potentially could be okay if you're listening to a news source that's on the right, take some time and listen to the one on the left and use some critical thinking skills.
Well, everything starts with, and then we talked about this in other programs. Everything starts with, let's stop being afraid. And to stop being afraid, you need to recognize that you're afraid, and that uncertainty is not tolerable for you, right? Once you recognize that, you have options, and one of the options you have is to make sure that you question, right? Um, and to understand that I'm a consumer of news. I'm not an object of manipulation, right? So when I only feel comfortable inside of my bubble of misery, right, and the only information I let into my bubble of misery is what makes me feel certain, even though it's irrational, then somebody needs to extend a hand to you and say, take a peek outside. Not because I want you to come with me, but because I want you to be you. And that is important because people are losing their sense of themselves and borrowing from somebody else's value, right? In terms of, I am nobody without you, my cult leader, right?
It's devolving into tribalism at the greatest extent.
Yeah, but tribalism usually leads to bad things, right?
Indeed,
I mean,
mob rule, mob mentality. Instead of, you said, going out of your bubble of misery, you're just inviting more people in.
yes, and we need to have dialogue, right? Um, and again, we need to start with ourselves, and then we need to extend into our families, and we need to extend the hands. And as I've said before, we really need to stop, think, be doubtful, right? And say, okay, where are those facts coming from? Are there counterfacts? Let's grow into having our own opinions, right? Let's stop buying into the idea that my little universe, right, of misery is the only safe place for me. There are other places where we can go with our emotions and our feelings, but nobody trusts anybody anymore. So the process of opening up and trusting um, needs to be developed again, right? Otherwise, we're gonna have to have a big, major crisis, which we almost had one last year, right? And what worries me is that the pandemic in other times would have been a great opportunity to get closer with each other and listen to each other. But it happened just the opposite. It just became a tool for us to spread apart even further. And at the end, we're all together in this game, right? I mean, there are a lot of bad things happening, but there are also a lot of good things happening. So unfortunately, real information about good news don't sell very much.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
and and there's a lot of good stuff happening in the world, you know. I mean, if you look at the last 30 years, poverty has gone down tremendously, right? Life expectancy, if not for COVID, has been actually pretty good, right? There's more people drinking clean water in the world. A lot of good stuff is happening. It didn't happen by accident. We all made it happen. But now we want to pull back, right? Because somebody tells us that their reality has to be our reality. And our reality has to be built by us, not by anybody else.
And I do notice that many people, again, are making their own bubbles of misery more crowded. Definitely bringing on some company. Politically, I don't want to get too into it, but I remember somebody saying, "I cannot believe X, Y, and Z was elected." Who I don't, and their statement was, "I don't know a single person who voted for him." And I was like, "Interesting." I have about 50-50. I have friends on both sides, and it really struck me that this is a person who has put himself in this bubble, again, made it crowded with his friends, has never looked out of it. To me, it wasn't a shock, but to them, it was an incredible shock. I mean, so much so that it really assaulted their full reality of how the world is. Instead of, wait a minute, if you have no friends outside of your political, leanings, how can you possibly know what the real world is like?
Yeah, and and unfortunately, that transcends culture. It transcends uh, country boundaries, right? I mean, a lot of people in my culture, I'm from the Hispanic culture, uh, moving to those political leanings, right? And then you said, how? How did that happen, right? And that's where you see the strength of disinformation, right? That people find hope in situations that because we have lived long enough, are not very hopeful, right? And despite the fact that, I mean, we're getting into pro segregation again. I mean, the small
They're
little things like
mind-boggling to me.
kids in cages. I mean, that reminds me of, and I'm sure for some older Jewish people, makes reminds them of desegregation, right? The
Mhm.
segregation that happened back in Europe, uh, as a tool of not necessarily manage culture, but as a tool of intimidation. You have to be afraid of me. And what they're really projecting, especially in the political sense, is this projection of, you're the enemy, but they never tell you I'm afraid of you, right? In this country in general, I would say 60-70% of the country is in the middle,
Mhm.
but is silent. And silence is probably the worst type of misinformation and disinformation,
Because
right?
it's tacit approval of the
Exactly.
behaviors.
Exactly. Now, I'm hopeful, right? And I think that a lot of the reactions that you're seeing politically nowadays, I'm very hopeful for the numbers and increases on the voting numbers from people between 18 and 30.
Yep.
If you look at the last election, it was massive increase, right? And this generation of 18 to 30 years old, very different. Not necessarily on the left, not necessarily on the right, but they are actually fighting for hope, because this is the people that I work with all the time. The teenagers of yesterday, they feel very hopeless, and they're really struggling for somebody to give them a signal of hope, right? They don't like what they're seeing. And you can say, well, that they're just young, they don't know anything, but they have a vote, right?
Absolutely. So for those people who are not in that demographic, and of course, obviously, as you mentioned, they're looking for hope. But for the people who are stuck in this system of disinformation and misinformation, what are the tools a person can use to first identify what misinformation is, or maybe even more importantly, recognize that they're being having disinformation thrown at them, and then they can trickle it down to what parts are misinformed.
The target of misinformation and disinformation, which is your brain, right, is the best tool you have to counteract that. So first you have to recognize that you have one, right? And that you have to question your own reality, right? If you don't raise the question of maybe there is another opinion, you're going to keep dancing around that circle, right? And I'm not saying that everything you believe is wrong. What I'm saying is that not everything you believe is right.
Mhm. And there must be a counterpoint to it somewhere.
Exactly. And the only way that you can create counterpoints is by utilizing your brain to have dialogue. Okay. Dialogue is the worst enemy of politicians. Even though they think they're experts in dialoguing with other people, they're not.
Mhm.
They're expert manipulators of, of,
Monologuing, actually.
of people, but they're not very good at dialogue, right? I mean, they're talking right now about not having debates, right? No more debates, right? What do we need to dialogue about? You go and get your people, I go and get my people, and let's see who's got more people. So how do we in the middle, those of us who grew up in this environment, get to learn about their opinions? But the reality is that they don't want us to know their opinions. They want us to know their facts as they're presenting them to us, and that's it. And that needs to stop, right? Because for just by simple reason, people die. I mean, I was watching the news before we started here, and I was looking at um, the bomb threats in historical black churches, right? Which fortunately they didn't find any bombs. But and then we have a police officer shot in a church. I mean, a church in the university. A couple of people got hurt, right? People die, uh, and they're not dying because of somebody else's principle. They're dying because of, well, somebody else's delusional and irrational thinking. Okay? I mean, I don't have any fantasy that we can help the whole world to be in the middle, right? But now we have too many people on one side and too many people on the other side, and they're not talking to each other. And the politicians don't want them to talk to each other. They want to keep them in their bubble of misery.
So it sounds like the savior might be that middle 60%. And I think you're right. That's who we have to look toward, and whichever side they slightly lean to. I mean, I deal with this in my other job. Um, people are frightened. They're coming to get firearms and self defense training and things. And I always tell them, I said, you do realize we live in the single least violent period of all human history. Even these, oh, but what about church shootings? Well, okay, look at the mass shootings. We had more mass shootings in the first part of the early '90s than we have in the entire. It's been we respond to these events, and it changes. But to them, it's real. It's real. It's there. It's after them. How do you help nurse somebody out of that irrationality?
Well, I mean, you have to invite them to get out of the irrationality. The problem is that nobody's doing the inviting
Mm,
because inviting makes no sense politically, it makes no sense power wise, it makes no sense financially. So, why do I want to get these people out of their irrational thinking in either side, right? I mean, when somebody says, you have to be against immigrants because they're coming for your jobs, right? I mean, I don't see a lot of white people picking up lettuce
I do not.
and oranges and working on the uh, how much the slave farms of chicken factories in the Midwest, right? Under terrible conditions, a lot of them illegal,
Mm.
right? So I don't see a lot of white people doing that. And I'm not against white people. I am white, even though I'm of Hispanic background, right? Same as
Preach.
you, right? But the reality is that we need to check the facts. We need to go back and say, okay, are they really coming for my job? Right? And that's tribalism. And that doesn't help anybody because, as bad as it sounds, this country is going to be a minority country pretty soon.
Hmm.
So you're seeing a lot of reactiveness to that. That's where the fear comes from, right? But you're absolutely right. Good news don't sell, dialogue don't sell, being in the middle and shaking hands don't sell. Okay? The old the old saying of let's agree to disagree, right?
Does no
We
longer
we
exist.
we don't have to hate each other.
It's devolved into a zero sum game, as you said.
Yes. So I mean, but again, I'm hopeful uh, because I was born in the early 1960s, so I'm 61, 62, and I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I didn't have to go to Vietnam and things like that. But I remember those times, right? Rough times, Nixon, you know, the 68, 69 generation and the anti-war protests and people dying in the universities. And I went to university and I had to go be part of those processes in the 70s and 80s. We have had rough times before,
Yes.
right? We have been divided before. Uh, One of the major problems, I wouldn't call it a problem, but I call it a consequence, is that democracy is difficult, right? Because democracy gives you the tools to be irrational.
Hmm.
And we have to respect the opinion of other people for as long as they're not yelling fire in the movie theater, right? So as long as they're not attacking me because of who I am, right? And they're willing to have a dialogue about ideas. I mean, I have to tell you, I just got back from visiting my home country, and I was there for 5 days with friends that I've known since I was 4 years old, right? And we sat down and we had dinner and things like that a couple of times during the time I was there, and we have dialogue. And I can tell you that there was very little we agreed upon, right? But we could talk, and we spent 2 or 3 hours having dinner, talking to each other, communicating with each other, teasing each other. I mean, telling me that I'm dumb and I don't know what I'm talking about. and having a conversation. I miss that. I really miss that here in this country because we used to have it,
Mm.
you know. We used to have that kind of dialogue. And I remember there was a time when I was the unpaid lobbyist for the Arizona Psychiatric Society, and I had to go to the state senate and the state House of Representatives and see them interact, and they will talk to each other. They didn't agree on a lot of stuff, but they talk to each other. That is not happening anymore. You know, you either with me or you're against me,
Mm.
and if you're against me, you're my enemy because either you look different or you are a different party or whatever. That needs to stop. We need to figure out a way to have some sort of dialogue.
So instead of, especially on the political side, instead of America first or Make America Great Again, it should be American first. We are American first. All other things, party, religion, race, color, creed, second. And
Correct.
but to begin that, I think we've been talking about this for the first part of this year. Has to start with a little bit of compassion for one another.
We have to have compassion and understanding that the person in front of us raising their voice and telling us how bad we are or how much they hate us, they're really projecting fear. And open our arms and say, I understand. In some ways, say, I understand you're afraid. How can I be of help? And instead of arguing how they're wrong, right?
Or how you're
Because,
right.
I see that every day. I mean, in my practice, I have patients from all different political spectrum, some in favor of this, some in favor of that. And it's not easy to maintain your neutrality, right? And to respect their opinion. So in the last couple of years, it has become kind of a norm for people to come and express their fears and their anger and their frustrations to me because I listen, right?
Mm.
But learning to listen in a non-judgmental way takes a lot of time and experience.
Well,
So
maybe we'll do a show about that here soon because I think that's probably what's missing is that skill set of
yeah, and then
non-judgmental listening.
but again, and for all my religious Christian friends, I have to say it again.
What
What
would
would
Jesus
Jesus
do?
do?
Absolutely. Well, once again, thank you very much, Doctor. I know you got to head off to dinner. I'm glad you're back from your trip safe and sound. Everybody out there, thank you for listening and interacting. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next week.
We'll see you soon. Take care.